Hello there, and welcome to the first session of Organisational Resilience and Reliability. My name is Mark Hall, and I'll be taking you through this first session, just recording my views and comments and taking you through the slides one after the other. Use this session or use these recordings as a way of thinking about and revising and going through the key points which are important to take into account when tackling the exam, which you'll have at the end, and also when you're thinking about putting together your presentation, your groups. Okay, so this session is primarily around risk and uncertainty, so we don't actually talk about resilience in any depth at all. That I pick up on the second session. Really what I'm focused on here is the background, the context to organisational resilience. So as I say, I'm interested in risk and uncertainty principally. I start with talking about what we mean by an organisation and then move on from there. But before any of that, I have a little bit of an introduction to myself. Here we go, this is me. I'm the module lead. That's my picture, and that's a word cloud of some of my main research interests. This is the book I've used. Now, I put this book together with my colleagues Elmar Kutsch and Neil Turner a couple of years ago, and so this is published I think in 2015, end of 2015. And although it's called Project Resilience, what I've done is use the structure of this book to work up a session on organisational resilience. And what you'll find is that a lot of the key ideas, a lot of the principles which myself and my colleagues picked up in this book, I've imported into this module and then broadened out the context to tackle organisational resilience rather than just project resilience. That's where you can find me, room 224. Those are my office hours for this term, and so you can pop along and see me at any time, and at the bottom is my website. Okay, so what I hope you're going to get out of this module. The first thing to say is that resilience as a topic is pretty new in general research and in the literature, but also in terms of teaching. Very, very new in terms of teaching. So you really are, as students, going to be at the cutting edge of this of the thinking in this module. There are one or two MSCs. For example, one is delivered by my colleague Elmar down at Cranfield University. He does some teaching on resilience, project resilience, and there's one or two other MSCs dotted around which have modules on resilience, but they're very, very few. So you really are at the cutting edge of thinking about how organisations can be made more robust and resilient in the face of uncertainty which they'll face in a globalised economy. Okay, the module's intended as an introduction, so what we're going to do is look at the key issues, the key aspects, and just touch on them really. Okay, I hope you can understand and critique traditional deterministic risk management, so that's what we're really going to be talking about today. I need you to demonstrate a comprehensive knowledge and understanding of the key fundamental concepts, theories, ideas of organisational resilience. Also, critically analyse resilience in organisations. Okay, so to what extent can organisations be regarded as being resilient? In what ways do they lack resilience? And how might organisations become more resilient? And does that even make sense? Also, demonstrate skills in verbal and written communication, team working, and critical analysis. I think all the MSc modules have that as a objective. Okay, so what we're going to do throughout this module is draw on theories and concepts and link these with practice. So throughout I use lots of examples in the teaching, and every session from here on, from session 2 through to the end of the module, we begin each session with a case study. So the idea is you read around the case material which I've put up on Canvas, and then use this to develop your thinking around the case. And normally that's focused on things we talked about in the previous session. So the idea is to pick up on what we've talked about in, for example, this session and session 1 about risk and uncertainty, that we picked up in the case which we begin the next session with. Okay, so we start with these little case studies from literature, from my own research, from all over the place, and that's the practice which you're linking back to theory and concepts which you covered in class. There isn't really a textbook, so as I said, I structure my this module around the book which I myself and my colleagues published in 2015. There's lots of readings which I've provided you with. There's references right through the module and all the lecture slides. You'll find lots of references, and there's a big reading list as well. So there's plenty for you to read around the subject on. Okay, there's 8 sessions throughout the module. That's it. So what are we going to talk about? Firstly, this first session is what can go wrong in organisations. This is really about risk and uncertainty. What do we mean by risk? What do we mean by uncertainty? And how can these impact organisations? Then in session 2, we move on to resilience and reliability as concepts. So really introducing what we mean by resilience, what I mean by reliability, and some of the key theories and concepts that apply to these ideas. Okay. Then what I'm going to tackle over the next 5 sessions are the headings from that book. So if you go and look at the cover of the book, which I wrote with my colleagues, you'll see that I have these terms: noticing, interpreting, preparing, and so forth. And I pick these up throughout the next 5 sessions. So we have vigilance and awareness in session 3, which is about organisations noticing what's going on in their environment, what's happening around them, and how they can think about that in relationship to their own organisation. Then session 4 is about interpreting, so organisations putting together processes and systems so they can understand the complexity about them. Session 5 is called preparing. It's about developing mental models among staff and among people within the organisation, empowering people within the organisation in order to have them in a position where they're able to respond should uncertainty, should crisis, should some problem occur. Then the session 6 is called containing, which is about developing commitment to dealing with adversity, improvising in the face of adversity, dealing with and focusing on tackling problems if and when they occur, and it almost always is a when, and in doing so, minimising the impact of that uncertainty on the organisation. In session 7, we talk about recovery. So if the organisation can notice what's going on, is vigilant, is prepared, contains what happens, then should something create problems for the organisation, how can it quickly recover and get itself back into operations very quickly? And then finally, a final session. This is actually based on chapter 8 in the book, which is bringing everything together, which is about what I've called a route to resilience. Okay, so the assessment for this module is a 20% group project, and 80% of the assessment is in a examination during the summer. You will be asked to examine and critique a real incident in a real organisation for your group project, and you can use that and build that into some of your responses in your examination. Okay, I've provided several organisations which you can choose from on Canvas, or you can select your own, and if you choose to select your own as a group, then please do ask me and discuss with me beforehand. Okay, you're expected to read for this module as with every other module you'll do, and these are some of the core textbooks which you can, or core texts, not really textbooks, core texts which you can draw upon to help with your reading. So we got Comfort, Boyne and Demchak at the top there, Designing Resilience. The next one, Holnagel, Woods and Leveson, Resilience Engineering. There are books on engineering-based concepts to resilience, and engineering organisations, that is, and books which are more organisational theory-based. So Holnagel et al. Is a resilience engineering book. Then there's the book which Elmar Neal and myself wrote, Project Resilience. Sheffy wrote a book called The Resilient Enterprise. Laura Valikangas wrote a book called The Resilient Organisation. She's done quite a lot of research around this topic. And Weick and Sutcliffe are key people in the field. So Carl Weick and Catherine Sutcliffe are key academics who've been doing research, some of the founders of this topic really, and they've produced a book called Managing the Unexpected, along with some other books with the strapline Resilient Performance in the Age of Uncertainty. So really at the core, the heart of what I'm talking about in this module. Okay, some of those books are available as e-books, others are available as just as hard copies from the library. I think they're all in the library in one way or another. Okay, all important books to think about. So, in the module, in the session, when I taught it, we started with thinking about BP and the Deepwater Horizon incident, which actually is one of the things you can look at for your if you want to do a group project. So you could, if you wanted to do Deepwater Horizon, or there are other examples of organisations and incidents you could look at for also available on Canvas. Okay, so there's a picture of Deepwater Horizon. It's a big disaster, impacted on BP, the main company involved, but there were other suppliers involved. It was a massive catastrophe, really. Okay, so what are the outcomes of the Deepwater Horizon? 11 workers were killed in the explosion, plus many injured. It's the biggest disaster ever. That's a quote. Environmental disaster, should I say. The aftermath was unprecedented in scale and complexity. BP and the main supplier, a company called Transocean, were implicated along with Halliburton, another organisation involved. They spent $3.8 billion, that should be $billion, by 2013. That was estimated to escalate maybe up to $20 billion. I mean, this is billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars for one incident. Litigation could last more than 20 years. Halliburton, one of the suppliers, paid $1.1 billion into a trust. Apart from just the huge cost of the incident, there were enormous reputational damage to all the organisations involved, and BP went from being one of the largest oil organisations in the world to, I think, the fourth or fifth largest, having to sell huge assets in order to cover the costs. Liabilities are estimated for the BP to maybe up to $42 billion, even some estimates of liabilities being even higher than that. So it was a major disaster for BP and its suppliers and the environment and the people who lived on the Gulf of Mexico coast. A huge disaster all around. Everyone lost out of this. Okay, now the question which I'd ask you is, was this a predictable disaster? Now that seems like a strange thing to say. Certainly BP at the time said, well, we could never have seen anything like this happening. We could never have foreseen it. But actually, if you look at what happened in BP leading up to this massive disaster, there are a whole catalogue of smaller disasters, accidents and near misses in North America and in other places around the world, which suggests something was going on in the organisation which wasn't quite right. The lack of recognition that there could be predictable surprises in oil exploration is a strange one, I think. We've got this big rig secured to the tethered to the ocean floor, and it's having to deal with tides and movements of the ocean, and is a engineeringly is a from an engineering perspective is a brittle system in and of itself, and to think that something couldn't go wrong is a strange decision to make. Certainly, if you look at some of the research around what happened here, it seemed that BP and its suppliers were privileging operational optimization over safety and risk management. And the last point, it's been turned into a film. I haven't seen the film yet, but intend to, and it came out last year, and I'd urge you to go and have a look at the film if you get a chance. Starring Mark Wahlberg, and there's the film. So it came out September 30th last year. Okay, now why was BP privileging operational optimization over safety? Well, one of the reasons I think possibly is because of the plunging oil price. At the time, oil prices were at a record low. They'd gone down and down and down and down. There's a massive oversupply of oil, and yet big rigs like Deepwater Horizon, very expensive systems to operate, which meant that the value of the oil being recovered from this rig was not really, only just maybe covering the costs of the whole operation. Not something BP wanted, so they're looking to optimize rather operationally, and other things were cut back, and that cutting back, you could argue, was one of the catalysts which led to this disaster. Okay, so there we are. That's the background to me and a little bit to the module. So what I started with in the session, and what I really want to think about first, is what we mean by an organisation. So it's called organisational risk and resilience. Organisational resilience and reliability. What's the organisational bit? So here's a quote. There's lots of quotes like this. This is one particular quote which I've picked up on, and if I take you through this very quickly, I've underlined some of the key words here. It's a social unit. I guess social could be underlined as well. It's a social unit of people that is structured and managed to meet a need. So it has some sort of need, some sort of purpose, and it seeks to achieve collective goals as an organisation through that purpose. So it's made up of people, individuals, who come together socially as a unit and are put into a structure to meet some sort of collective goals and a need for the organisation. All organisations have a management structure that determines relationships. So this determines who's in charge, how the hierarchy works, who's subordinate, the relationships between the people within the organisation, and then that determines to some extent their activities, what they do, how they do it, why they do it, and the members of those different of those activities, and subdivides and assigns roles and responsibilities. An authority, who is in charge, who determines what has to be done, and who is responsible for what happens. Okay, all organisations are open systems. They're open systems meaning they're exposed, they affect and can be affected by their environment. Okay, so I talked a little bit about what we mean by organisations. Often people think about private organisations, and private organisations obviously are organisations, but organisations can be large organisations, small organisations, they can be public sector organisations, so governments and local authorities and other public sector groupings are organisations with money, tax money in that case. They can be charities or other third sector organisations, and maybe quasi-public private organisations like universities and other major organisations which have some sort of private element to them. So organisations take all forms. What do? They exist to provide products, services, or a combination of both. And all organisations have stakeholders, both internal, which are the people, members of the organisation, and external, who can be customers or consumers, end users, financiers, and other people and groups who might have an interest in what the organisation does. Okay, here's some examples. Apple, obviously a very large private sector organisation. Manchester United what is Manchester United? It's a strange one, really. It's kind of a private organisation. It's owned by a pair of brothers, I think, American brothers, and so in that sense it's a private organisation, but it's also got a public element that everyone takes an interest in this and other football clubs, other sporting clubs. So it's a kind of strange organisation, but it's still an organisation. Starbucks, another major private organisation. The World Health Organization is a strange one. That's funded by nations and has this kind of strange status, but still an organisation. Rolls-Royce, a major private organisation. NASA, a huge public organisation, but with very close links to the private sector. And Oxfam, a charity. So lots of different types of organisation. I could have easily put Birmingham City Council there, the Chinese national government, anyone really, any group of people who come together and organise themselves in order to deliver some sort of need through services and or products. Okay, so what are the features of organisations? Organisations comprise people, have structure, functions, hierarchies and strategic goals. They contain social structures, power relationships and culture. So they are structure and people. And they provide services and products in the form of they work with other organisations to provide those services and products. Nearly all organisations work with other organisations in some kind of supply network or supply chain. So there's a dependency between different organisations. Okay, so that's the background to organisations. The next thing was talking about risk. So what do we mean by risk? Well, here's some examples of disasters which have happened and have impacted upon organisations around the world. Okay, so I started with Foxconn. If you wanted to, you could look at this organisation as part of your group project. So Foxconn, the key supplier to Apple and many other consumer electronics companies, they had problems with their working conditions and people being driven suicidal by their working conditions is a major problem for that particular organisation. There's the 2008 financial disaster, financial crash. Volkswagen, you may remember a couple of years ago, Volkswagen were in the news and had a major embarrassing disaster. This major organisation, car manufacturer, because they were cheating the emissions tests for their diesel vehicles, and that cost them billions of euros. And here's another example. These things happen all the time. This is an earthquake, this time in New Zealand, Christchurch. This happened a few years ago as well, and hit the news because I guess people don't really think of New Zealand having earthquakes, and they're commonplace in many countries. But perhaps New Zealand wasn't regarded as one of those countries which would be affected by earthquakes. But it's been created by earth movements, geological movements, and that hit Christchurch some years ago, and they've had many after tremors since then. Okay, so we're talking here about risk and uncertainty. Now, here's a kind of maybe a slightly glib phrase: the future will not be like the past. Nothing in the future is quite like the past. We are always faced with different things going on. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Maybe it will be like the past in some ways, but in other ways it certainly will be different. Okay, so organisations face increasing uncertainty, I argue. So, why? Competition. Competition everywhere, and as different nations develop their economies, then those nations are in competition with existing economies. And so organisations and people and governments around the world try to respond to this in different ways. Okay, so competition, instability. So things are changing all the time. Brexit's an example. Trump becoming president of the United States is another example. This has created massive instability in the global economy. And uncertainty in a globalised world. These have become, I would argue, constants. They're always happening. Wars. Just have to think about Syria, which has been going on for 8 years now. And before that we had Iraq and Afghanistan. Major upheavals in the Middle East. Things going on in the South China Sea, between China and its neighbours. So all sorts of things going on all around the world. Brexit, I mentioned, I think. Lots of different things going on in the world. And these are all going to impact on organisations. Okay, the unexpected can assail the organisation, any organisation. It could be a large organisation, a small one, private, public sector or third sector. In many cases, traditional risk and governance models, I argue, are insufficient. They're inadequate. They are too rigid to cope with this uncertainty, to cope with the unexpected, to deal with the instability that these organisations around the world face. Organisations have to accept that not all events can be planned for. And then I picked up on this little phrase, this quote from Moltke, who was a disciple of Clausewitz. He said, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." Now, Moltke suggested that in war, all people all armies should plan for every eventuality. Okay, so he said make multiple plans for all possibilities. I would argue, A, is this even possible? And B, if it's possible, is it reasonable? How much effort, how much work would you have to put into planning for everything? You can't plan for everything because actually you don't know what everything will be. So in that sense, I think that his suggestions are problematic. And also, if you think about war, someone wins and someone loses. There's a winner and a loser. So, despite planning for everything, someone's got to lose, even if both parties plan for everything. So, let's think about a crisis. I think a lot of people within organisations think that this is the kind of thing we have. So, you have a starting point, a planned trajectory, and you deviate slightly up and down from that trajectory, and then suddenly something unexpected happens and it's a disaster, and the organisation either recovers or goes out of business or disappears as a result of that disaster. That there's a sudden thing which happens. And I think sometimes this does happen in organisations, but actually what I think happens is more like this, that we have a planned path, and actually what happens is things start to go wrong slowly, maybe unnoticed, maybe hidden somewhere, or the different things going wrong aren't quite pieced together, and so we have a creeping disaster, a creeping problem emerging within the organisation, which then the organisation either recovers from or goes into non-survival. Okay. Now you can find this diagram in the textbook. Sorry, not the textbook. The book I wrote with my colleagues. It's on page 11. It's unusual in that I haven't actually got the reference here, I don't think. But that can be found on page 11 of the book which myself and my colleagues wrote. We called it The Differing Dynamics of Crises. Oh, in fact the reference is there, but I haven't got the page number, so it's page 11 of the textbook. Okay, so what do we mean by risk? So the risk concept is basically two aspects. It's about likelihood and impact. Okay, so risk is a function of likelihood and impact. The likelihood is what's the chances of something happening, and the impact is should it happen, what would its effect be on the organisation. Okay, there's lots of theories around risk. We have economic theories of risk. The principal of those is economic utility theory, but game theory is also quite influential in the way organisations think about risk. Now, economic theories of risk are predominant in risk management systems and risk processes, but there are other ways of thinking about risk. Psychological theories of risk. This is what goes on in people's heads. We have things like cognitive heuristics, by which I mean rules of thumb and ways of judgment that people have built into their heads, hardwired, if you like, into their brains. And these are very important to the way people respond to different situations. We also have something which I've called the psychometric paradigm, which is about the way people understand or make sense of risk. Okay, what is valid knowledge to somebody? What isn't valid knowledge to somebody? How do people understand and see the world, and how does this impact on their way of making sense of risk? And then finally we have social theories of risk, cultural theories of risk. Mary Douglas is and Verdowski were very influential in developing cultural theories of risk. And something that myself and my colleague Elmar have worked on in the past, rationality and deliberate ignorance of risk, that people behave in particular ways, and that behaviour impacts on the way they make sense of and rationalise their responses to risk. Okay. So then I talked a bit about the Black Swan theory, a very, very influential book which talked about the idea that although we might think we know everything about the environment, there might still be something out there which we hadn't expected, could never even think to expect. So the example that Nicholas Tayob uses is of the Black Swan, and at one time, that's the cover of his book, by the way, and at one time it was thought all swans were white because all swans found in nature were white, until Captain Cook discovered the Australia, and what did he find there? Black swans. Who would have thought it? Nobody actually thought it. Okay, so Nicholas Taylor came up with this book. I'd recommend, if you get a chance to read it, it's a very readable book and very enjoyable to read, and really makes you think about what we mean by risk. So the key points coming out of this book that which Taylor came up with were that, one, there's a disproportionate role is paid to high-profile, hard-to-predict and rare events that are beyond the realm of normal expectations in history, science, finance and technology. So these events in history, in science, in finance, in technology have a disproportionate role on or impact on organisations and society at large. Okay, so they're important. That because they are high profile but hard to predict and very rare, they're very difficult to understand in terms of probability, although probability is the main way of understanding risk. Okay, so when we think about risk, we think about what's the probability of something happening, but these things, these events, these black swans are virtually impossible to predict. Okay, and his third point, which he picked up, was that people in their heads have a psychological bias. If you think back to my cognitive heuristics and the psychometric paradigm I talked about previously, this is what I'm getting at here. You have psychological biases that blind them, both individually and collectively, so as organisations, to uncertainty, to those rare events that have such an important role in the progress of history. So, black swans, his theory was black swans are these major events, but they are very rare, very unusual, and really almost impossible to predict. Often you'll find these little YouTube clips down the bottom there, greyed out a bit, and this is one example of Donald Rumsfeld, who came up with known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And really what he is articulating, although it's in a fairly humorous way, and everyone found it quite funny, but actually it was quite profound. What he said was that we know some things might happen, those are known knowns. We know some things could happen, but we don't know what they are, or what their likelihood is, those are known unknowns. And then there's things out there, the black swans, which we haven't even considered or even envisaged, couldn't even dream of, but they could still happen, the unknown unknowns. Okay, this guy is Frank Knight, and he came up in the 1940s with a really important distinction between risk and uncertainty, so an economic distinction. Okay, sorry, 1920s. He took the view that he used expected utility theory, and he took the view that risk is randomness, which can be mathematically understood and to which probability can be applied. Okay, so everything we can model, everything we can make sense of, everything we can gather data about is risk. Everything else, which we are unable to predict, unable to model, unable to express in probabilities, is uncertainty. And this is a really useful and profound distinction between the two. Okay, Anderson came up with this view that risk management is defensive, and uncertainty could be seen as a threat and an opportunity. Interestingly, risk in history was regarded as opportunity, and over time the definition of the word has changed from being an opportunity to a threat. So risk is seen as a threat, and is therefore the response is defensive, to protect the organisation or people, whereas uncertainty is seen often as a threat and an opportunity. Okay, another way of thinking about risk and uncertainty, this is from Maurizio's book Organisational Myopia, another kind of interesting and engaging book. He said that human social systems are complex and non-ergodic. By non-ergodic, what he means is that they don't necessarily conform to a predictable state. So over time, ergodicity is about organisations or systems, systems really, mathematical systems, physical systems, always returning to a state which we can make sense of, which are predictable in some way over time, given enough time, and that organisational, human social systems, like organisations, are so complex that they can go in all sorts of different directions, and we often can't predict which direction they're going to go in. Okay, the concept of rhetoric and risk for Maurizio has transformed from one of opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, for gain to one of opportunities for loss, threats. Okay, now these are 2 points which he really picks up in this book. And what he says is that we are blind to this. We're blind to this sense that risk is an opportunity as well as a threat, and that organisations are non-predictable and systems are non-predictable. Human social systems are non-predictable. So he talks about bolts from the blue, sudden surprises, or whether surprises are actually predictable. Because if we understood that social systems are complex, non-ergodic systems, and if we understood that the rhetoric of risk has changed, then we wouldn't be surprised about these bolts on the blue, as we call them, these surprises, these Deepwater Horizon events. Okay, they're predictable. And if you look at organisations, if you look at the history of organisations, you can see the lead up to these big disasters. What I call weak signals, the weak signals that something is going to go wrong. Okay, I'll talk a bit about the risk horizon. This is also talked about in our book. You can find this in a slightly different form on page 8 of the book, where I called it the risk horizons. This is actually my idea, so this is something I personally came up with, and then we built it into our book. So the risk horizon is the idea that if you imagine somebody in a valley, at the bottom of a valley, all they can see is an horizon, which is the walls of the valley. Okay, if they climb up onto the up those walls, up the side of the valley, they'll see more. And risk can be seen in the same way. That analogy helps to understand what risk and uncertainty are. So the idea of the risk horizon is that you have the world out there, there's the observer in the middle, you have the world out there, and what they can see is what they can make sense of. Everything else is uncertain, is unknown. Okay, so the risk horizon is what they can actually see, and everything beyond it is the rest of the world, the uncertainty. Everything inside the horizon is risk. If you've got risk, you can model it, you make sense of it, you can put plans together for it. Everything else is uncertainty. Now, on the one hand, I argue that risk horizon can be expanded. So you can climb up the side of the valley and you'll see more. Okay, so you can expand your risk horizon. You can expand the horizon, the extent to which you can see risk and make sense of it, by doing what? Collecting data. In reality, collecting data of gathering more information. Okay, so the horizon bleeds into uncertainty. More of the uncertainty becomes risk. Okay, so what's the nature of risk and uncertainty? It can affect the goal of what we're trying to achieve. Okay, so it can affect the outcome, the output of the organisation. Okay, it can affect how we achieve things, so it can affect our processes. And finally, it can affect the relationships between people and between organisations in terms of what I've called the epistemological and ontological differences of what constitutes risk. Some people see risk in one way, some people see risk in another way, and this is determined partly by their understanding cognitively of what we mean by risk and uncertainty, and culturally. Okay, I use a little clip of from a film called Clerks as a way of thinking about who built the Death Star. So Death Star from Star Wars. Okay, and it's a little clip there which you can find. You can see it grayed out if you want to watch that again. Okay, so what's the aim of risk management? So here we're talking about what the traditional process of risk management involves. Okay, so the aims are a comprehensive identification of all possible risks. So expanding your risk horizon maybe. Certainly think about everything in the risk horizon, everything encompassed by the risk horizon, and trying to comprehensively identify it. An objective assessment and understanding of what each of those risks are. A current diagnosis of the organisation's position, strategies for managing risk, and focus management attention on the process and on the outcomes of risk management. Okay, this has a lot of assumptions in it. So, for example, the second point there, we talk about objective assessment and understanding of risk. What do you mean by objective? Objective to whom? One person's view of risk could be very different to another person's view of risk. That's about our epistemology of risk, what constitutes valid knowledge of risk, and our ontology of risk, what constitutes a risk and what constitutes uncertainty. The aims of risk management are to eliminate uncertainty, which we call avoidance, to transfer liability and ownership to other organisations who are better able to manage risk, which we call transfer, to reduce what's left to an acceptable level, which is mitigating risk, and then finally to accept and manage whatever's left over after all that, which is controlling the residual risk. Okay, we can think about it as a process, as a flow chart. So the process involves, first of all, risk management, having a strategy or planning process in place, and then the first step is to identify risk. And out of this, the outcome of that risk identification process is often a list, a big list of all the possible risks that might impact on an organisation. This can be done sometimes on a regular basis, or when an organisation is going into a new project or a new phase. And then we analyse each of the risks on the risk list, okay, or risk schedule sometimes it's called, and we can analyse those risks qualitatively or quantitatively. This leads to a risk matrix, which is a list of all the risks, their probability, and the impact should they occur. Okay, so remember, risk is a function of probability, what's the likelihood of it happening, and its impact should it happen. Now, for each of those risks, we can put together a risk response planning process. And what we're focusing on here normally are the important risks, the major risks which will impact on the organisation. Those with high likelihood and high impact. We can divide the risks into those which are manageable, where we can put together an action plan, and critical risks. Those are crucial risks which almost certainly will happen. Very high likelihood, and if they are to happen, then they're going to have some sort of impact on us. And we put in place a contingency plan. What happens if something goes wrong? We monitor and control what's happening as we proceed through our operations, and this process is an ongoing process. Okay, so there we are. We have a sense of what should happen. Now, my question to you during the session and now is, what does happen in reality? Why does it happen? And what are the possible consequences? Fosdick came up with a really nice quote. Okay, I'll leave you to read that in your own time. What he's saying is basically we're biased. So the risk management process seems like an objective process. Actually, it's driven by people, and each person has their own bias. It's cultural bias, a cognitive bias, and there's an assumption of scientific accuracy in this process, and we all assume that what we've produced is an economically rational process of risk management. Actually, there's a huge amount of personal bias in there, and this skews what organisations come up with as a plan for their risk management. Some research that myself and my colleague Elmar Kutsch has done. You can find these papers there. I think I've put them both onto Canvas. We looked at some behavioural factors for, even if you are doing risk management, the risk management is done very poorly, in a very perfunctory way, and sometimes people don't even do it at all in their operations. Why is that? For a number of reasons. So we came up with what we call denial of uncertainty, avoidance of uncertainty, delay of uncertainty, and ignorance. So denial of uncertainty is denying that a risk is actually a risk, or that uncertainty is actually is even in existence, that what we're going to do is carry on, and that there isn't any uncertainty out there. We don't really believe in risk, don't really believe in uncertainty. Okay, if we do believe in it, then we avoid it. We avoid dealing with it. We avoid tackling it. And often, even if we believe in risk, understand risk, and kind of recognise that it's there and a possibility, what organisations and people within organisations, managers tend to do is delay their decision. Delay until it's too late. And then the risk, and they're delaying just in case it doesn't happen, because they don't want to spend the money and the effort and the time dealing with something which may never happen. Okay? And finally, ignorance of uncertainty. Ignorance of particular risks or possibilities of risk, or even the process of managing risk. What we also found that is what we argue, that it's not irrational to fail to implement a risk management system or process if you think that's going to impact on your future employment, on your future activities, and just cease your organisation's operations. Okay, and that comes to the end. That brings us to the end, and there's some takeaway points. So, organisations take all shapes and forms. They can be public sector, private sector, third sector, they can be large or small. This is important. Okay, so organisations look like all sorts of different things. Okay, they contain people. This is important as well. They contain people who form groups, develop cultures, have their own vested interests and biases and interdependencies. Okay, I asked you to think about what is risk, so you should come away from this session having a sense of what we mean by risk, what we mean by uncertainty, and what the difference is between those two, and how they can be viewed. Okay, and then think about some of the problems with traditional risk management practices and assessment practices. Okay, and that's it. So before next session, I'm going to ask you to think about the Challenger space shuttle disaster, and these are some questions which we will be asking in the session. And there's a video. Okay, so that's pretty much the session finished and completed. Feel free to come and see me in my office hours if you want to discuss any things you have concerns with or want to talk about things further. Otherwise, I'll expect you to be looking at the Challenger disaster for the next session. Thank you.